What's going on, guys? Today I'll be picking one move I think every NBA team should make this offseason. First up, we have the Atlanta Hawks, who have a pretty good young team consisting of John Collins, Trae Young, DeAndre Hunter, Cam Reddish, and they also have Clint Capella, who they got at the trade deadline in 2020 season. And they also are projected to have a pretty good draft pick in the 2020 draft. They were 14th in the Eastern Conference this past season with a record of 20-47. So they just need experience to become a better team and can make a playoff run. So if they got maybe a backup center or point guard, not too many moves they would really need to do, or a huge player to get in the off-season, because Trae Young is already an all-star starting point guard, and Clint Capella is a pretty good defender at the center position. So maybe I'd lean more towards a center for them to get, but again, not too many moves they would need to make this offseason. Next, we have the Boston Celtics, who finished as the 3 seed when the NBA season was suspended. And for them, I would think they would need a center. They are pretty good at point guard. They have Kemba Walker. Marcus Smart is a guard off the bench. Jaylen Brown at shooting guard. Tatum can play either forward position. Hayward is a free agent this offseason, and they do have Cantor and Tice as their center. So I'd probably go with them needing a new center. Out of anything, I don't really think they need to make a ton of moves. They have a ton of young pieces, like Jaylen Brown, Tatum, and they got 5 rookies in the 2019 draft. Well, 4 and 1 was undrafted. So Cantor is a pretty good offensive rebounder, and Tice is better on the defensive end. So they kind of need a stronger defender. Not that Tice isn't a good defender. He's a decent defender, but they could have better. They do have Robert Williams III, who they got in the 2018 draft, but has been injured, so hasn't played a ton, and still has a lot to grow to become a good NBA player. So I would probably go with them needing a better center next year, or if anything. Next up, we have the Brooklyn Nets, who didn't have the season that people would expect them to have. Durant was out the whole season, and Irving was out most of the season with an injury. So mostly Dinwiddie was one of their key players, and they had Karis LeVert, DeAndre Jordan, Temple, Prince, and Jarrett Allen. So this offseason, I don't think they need to make too many moves. It was more about their health, and I think they'll have a good year next year once Durant is back and Irving is injury-free. But if I had to say a position they'd need, probably maybe at the forward position, if they could trade to get a better power forward, or a backup maybe, or from free agency, but don't really need too much. Jarrett Allen is a good young defender and rebounder, and they have Durant, who's going to probably play small forward or power forward, and Dinwiddie off the bench, and maybe LeVert at shooting guard, and Irving at point guard. So they're pretty good for their starting 5, so again, not too much they need to do in the offseason, but if I had to say a position they could get more of, it would probably be the forward position. Next up, we have the Charlotte Hornets, who aren't going to make the playoffs this year. The NBA restart is about a little over a month from now, so they aren't going to be participating in that in Orlando. They did have a decent season with Devontae Graham, who had a very good season compared to last year. They also were able to draft P.J. Washington Jr. in the draft in 2019, or this past draft. And they also have Malik Monk, and not a ton of key players. They still have some rebuilding to do, but this offseason, I think they could maybe get a center or a backup point guard. Devontae Graham, mainly, he does play point guard, but I see him more as a shooting guard, but maybe a center, a good defender for them or a guard off the bench. Next, we have the Chicago Bulls, who are pretty good at the guard position, with Kobe White, who is a good point guard, and Zach LaVine, who can play shooting guard. Two players that can be all-stars one day. Kobe White, this was his rookie season. Zach LaVine had a pretty good year, and I think that you really need to fire Jim Boylen. He's not a great coach. I feel like the Bulls could have a much better record this year without him. Markkanen has some time to improve, but he hasn't shown his full potential yet. And Wendell Carter Jr., same thing with him. He's a good defender, good center, but I think mainly what the Bulls need is a small forward for their starting five to either trade for, maybe trade their upcoming draft pick, or get someone in free agency. Next, we have the Chicago Bulls, who were able to draft Darius Garland with a top 5 pick this past draft. They were also able to get Andre Drummond at the trade deadline this past season, and they already had Kevin Love and Colin Sexton, so they're pretty good at the guard position and power forward and center. So this offseason, I think that they would maybe need to trade for a role player for a small forward, or maybe trade Kevin Love to get a good forward. Next up, we have the Dallas Mavericks, who are a very talented team and have very young players that are very talented, including Luka Doncic, who was an all-star in his second year in the league this year, was an all-star starter. Then they also have Kristaps Porzingis at the forward/center position, who has been in the league for about around 4 years. And they were able to get Jalen Brunson in the 2018 draft, who was a point guard, and I feel that he's very underrated and is a good role player for them. I mean, they don't really need another star considering they have Doncic and Porzingis. They were in a very high seed in the Western Conference. Currently, as of recording this, they are the 7th seed, so not really what they would want to be, but I think that in a few years, they'll definitely be a top 3 team or better in the Western Conference. So this offseason, I think they might need to get a center or a forward. Porzingis is a good defender and also good on the offensive side too. So maybe if he played power forward and they got a better center, I think that would fit them well. They also have Tim Hardaway Jr., who's a decent player. So just really small pieces to put around their star players in Porzingis and Doncic. Next up, we have the Denver Nuggets, who are very talented at the center position, as well as the guard position. Nikola Jokic, one of the better players on their team. He's a big man that's able to score. He's also a good playmaker for his size, as well as a defender. They got Jamal Murray, who is able to score the ball well at point guard. And they were able to get Michael Porter Jr. I believe he was outside of a lottery pick, a little higher than the 16th pick in the 2018 draft. And I think that was a steal. He wasn't really healthy coming into the draft. He came off an injury from college. But I think that he has a ton of potential, and he can be a pretty good player in this league and be a big piece if he stays with the Nuggets in their future to possibly an NBA championship run. So considering those pieces, I think that a good option for the Nuggets this offseason would be to try and pick up a role player at the power forward position. Again, they have a lot of strong pieces at the guard and center position, so I don't think they need too much. Currently, their power forward is Paul Millsap, who's towards the end of his career, so if they are able to pick up a good role player again at the power forward position, that's what I would think they could do. I don't think they need to make too many moves. They've been playing pretty well the last few seasons in the playoffs, so I think it's a matter of them just being able to go farther in the playoffs and play well. Next up, we have the Detroit Pistons, who are currently in rebuild mode. They do have an upcoming lottery pick. Not sure what pick it is yet. We'll see after the draft lottery. So I think if they are this upcoming draft class isn't amazing, but it isn't bad. There isn't any really players that are really good and stand out. I feel like a bunch of them are solid players. So if they are able to pick up and draft a good player, then I think that would help them. But really, their best player right now is Blake Griffin, who did not have the best year. I think he was injured towards the beginning of the season and throughout it. So I think what they need to do this offseason is trade Blake Griffin and maybe get some picks out of it. Derrick Rose is not in his prime of his career, not how he was playing when he was an MVP in the early 2010s, but he did play well for them this year. They were able to draft Sekou Doumbouya as a lottery pick, or close to a lottery pick in the 2019 draft. So I think that he has a lot of potential and can be a great player. Didn't play amazing this year, but showed that he has time to grow and can be a key piece of this franchise or a different franchise. But for now, I think that the Pistons should just try and really trade Blake Griffin and get picks or some role players for their team so they can start to become a playoff team again. Next up, we have the Golden State Warriors, who are mostly known for their offense with Steph Curry and Klay Thompson. Both of them have not played a ton of games this year. Klay Thompson didn't play any so far, and Curry played very few games due to a broken wrist injury. So a lot of the young Warriors, like Eric Pascal and Jordan Poole, had to play this season. Pascal showed he was a pretty good player and has a ton of potential. Jordan Poole, more of a role player, but still played well. Draymond Green didn't put up all-star numbers like he did a few years ago, but definitely a little under-average season for him, but still played decent. So I think it's more for the Warriors that they don't need to make a ton of moves this offseason. They were able to trade D'Angelo Russell for Andrew Wiggins at the trade deadline. So I think that if they get they really need a center as a good defender, if anything, for them to do in this offseason. So that's one move I think they make. But if they stay healthy, they have a pretty solid lineup with Curry, Thompson, Wiggins, Draymond Green, or Eric Pascal. And if they could pick up a good defender or a center that's a good role player or just a defender, doesn't really need to be an all-star player, that's what I think would work out for them. Next up, we have the Houston Rockets, who currently had a decent season. They were able to get Russell Westbrook in the offseason. In the 2019 offseason, they had to trade Chris Paul and some other players and picks. But I think it was a good move because I think it really worked out for the Thunder and the Rockets. Thunder kind of knew that once Paul George requested a trade that Westbrook was probably going to have to go too, because that team was going to fall apart, because if there wouldn't have been any chemistry. So Chris Paul ended up having a good year. He was an all-star. The Thunder had a really good year. They were one of the top few teams in the Western Conference. So Westbrook actually had one of the best seasons he's had probably since his MVP season a few years ago. And along Harden, who's always a good offensive threat. So this is another team with really good players at the guard positions. Harden at shooting guard and Russell Westbrook at point guard. But I think what they really need to do this offseason is get a good defender. They did trade Clint Capella at the trade deadline to the Hawks. So PJ Tucker played a lot of center for them. So they had a small ball lineup going. Didn't have a ton of height. Not really small ball, but they had a smaller lineup for their height. But I think they really need to go out and try and get a good defender or center. They already are good on the offensive end, and they haven't really been able to make a huge playoff run in past years, getting beaten by the Warriors. So we'll see how they do this year in the playoffs, but I really think they need a defender in the offseason. Next up, we have the Indiana Pacers, who I believe are a very underrated team in this league. A lot of people look at them and don't see them as a playoff team that can make a deep run, but they do have a few all-star players on their team. Sabonis was an all-star this year for the first time, and Oladipo was an all-star in the 2018-19 season, but he did not play because he was injured. But before he had that major injury last year, he was playing amazing. Definitely one of the best years in his career. And this year he came back, didn't play as great because he missed most of the season, part of the season due to that injury from last year. They also have Miles Turner, who's a great defender at the center position. So one move I think they can make this offseason, this is another team that's really good at the guard position. They also have Malcolm Brogdon, who's a younger player and can be more than a role player, not really an all-star type player, but he would play good alongside Oladipo and the Pacers. And they also have Aaron Holiday, who is a role player right now, also a young player, but has some potential. But one move I think they can make is getting a new small forward as a role player. I don't think they need to make a ton of moves. They are a young team, so I don't think they need to get any major players. TJ Warren was their small forward in the 2019-20 season, or this past season. So maybe someone that can replace him and just a role player at that position. Next up, we have the Los Angeles Clippers, who had a really good offseason in 2019 offseason, where they were able to sign Kawhi Leonard and trade for Paul George. They did have to give up a ton of draft picks to get Paul George, and also traded a young star with a lot of potential in Shai Gilgeous-Alexander to the Thunder. So I believe that for this season and the next few seasons, it was a good trade. The Clippers are currently second in the West and have a pretty good chance at making a playoff run to probably at least the Western Conference Finals, where they are expected to probably face off against the Lakers to see who goes to the finals. So they are good really at the small forward position, or the forward position for Kawhi Leonard, and the shooting guard position for Paul George. They do have Lou Williams and Pat Beverly, who are very good players alongside Leonard and George. Pat Beverly is a very good defender for his size, and Lou Williams is one of the best six men in the game, who's basically a backup for, or a reserve for, Pat Beverly. So they're pretty good at the 1, 2, and 3 position. They do have Montrezl Harrell, who plays power forward and center, and Zubac, who plays center. So they're a pretty good team. Don't need to make a ton of moves. It's just a matter if they can win the championship or go far. So I would probably say that they can maybe get a forward. If anything, I don't think they really need to make a ton of moves. Maybe get a nice backup small forward for Leonard, but if he does continue to do load management, they'll need a role player that can play in his position while he's not playing. Next up, we have the Los Angeles Lakers, who are arguably one of the best teams in the league, alongside the Milwaukee Bucks and some other teams. Very talented at the forward position with LeBron James. People say he's a bunch of different positions. Some people say he's a point guard, but I really classify him as a small forward. That's the position that really suits him the most. I know he brings up the ball sometimes. They were able to get Anthony Davis in a trade in the offseason, so he plays power forward. And then for center, they usually have JaVale McGee and Dwight Howard. But a position they really don't have a ton of good players is at the guard position. They have Avery Bradley and Rajon Rondo, but they don't have a ton of great shooters at the position. Rondo is more of a veteran and a playmaker, but he is towards the end of his career. So I think that one move they could try and make is get a decent guard. They do also have Danny Green, but not a ton of long-term guys. I think one thing they could probably do in the offseason is trade Kyle Kuzma. Depending on what they do with Davis, depending on what Davis does, he is a free agent. So I think that if he decides to stay, they should try and trade Kuzma to try and get a solid guard, and they can have another playoff run, depending on how they play this year. There's a bunch of different factors, but one thing I definitely think they need to do this offseason is get a better guard. Next up, we have the Memphis Grizzlies, who are currently the 8th seed in the Western Conference. They have a ton of young talent in John Morant, who they selected second in the 2019 draft, and Jaren Jackson Jr. with the 4th pick in the 2018 draft. So both of those players have a chance to be an all-star caliber players. John Morant had a really good season. Didn't put up exactly all-star numbers, pretty close. Didn't get an all-star selection in the fan voting. But Jaren Jackson is a great defender as well as on the offensive end. So I think that the Grizzlies are another team in the league that need potential and some other pieces. They need a center. I mean, right now they have Valanciunas as their starting center. He's not amazing, but he's not horrible. I think there were some rumors that he could be traded to the Warriors, and they can get a pick in the 2020 draft and maybe get a center in the draft like James Wiseman. But I think they should try and maybe go for a good veteran center. This offseason, there's Tristan Thompson. Not a ton of great centers out, but I think Tristan Thompson might be a good fit. Or they can try and trade for a center. They do have a lot of money to spend. I mean, they're probably going to have to give some contracts to Jaren Jackson Jr. and Morant, depending on when their rookie contracts expire soon. But I think one move that they can make this offseason, again, is a center, either trying to sign a free agent or maybe trade Valanciunas and some future picks. Next up, we have the Miami Heat, who got Jimmy Butler in the 2019 free agency, or the offseason. So he mostly plays small forward. They were able to sign Kendrick Nunn as an undrafted free agent. He plays point guard, and they played Tyler Hero at shooting guard, but he sometimes came off the bench, or most of the time came off the bench, and they played Duncan Robinson. So those are three young players at the guard position, and they had Jimmy Butler at small forward. Bam Adebayo was an all-star, as well as Jimmy Butler. Adebayo played center. So they have some good pieces. Adebayo, this is his 3rd year in the league, so being an all-star in your 3rd year in the league shows that you have a bright future, and you can, hopefully have a good rest of your career, and I think that he's a good piece for the Heat and can be a franchise player for them for the rest of his career, or at least for the next 4 to 5 years or more. And they also have, again, those guards and Jimmy Butler. So one position I think that they could work on if they had to get someone this offseason is at the power forward position. So, again, they're a team that's not one of the best teams in the league, but still a very decent team in the league. Maybe just a role player at the power forward position. So I think it's just a matter of getting Adebayo some experience, and same thing with Hero and Nunn. I think they can both be good players in a few years, and maybe the Heat can be a top 3 team in the Eastern Conference and try and make a playoff run. Next up, we have the Milwaukee Bucks, who are currently one of the best teams in the league, arguably also with the Lakers. Right now, they are in pretty good shape, don't need to make any moves at all, really. play around their superstar in Giannis Antetokounmpo, who won MVP in the 2018-19 season. Chris Middleton, also All-Star last year, was a good. He's a good player to play alongside Giannis. He's not really just a role player. He's a pretty good player who can shoot the ball and can contribute to the team well, along with Giannis. So they don't really need to make too many moves at the forward position, and Middleton sometimes could play like shooting guard. They're pretty good, but if I had to pick a move that they need to make, maybe getting a new center or point guard. Dante DiVincenzo is a young player, second-year player this year, who can play guard, who's shown that he can be a role player alongside Giannis. For next season, I think a good fit for them would be maybe a new center. Brook Lopez is a decent player, but if they were really able to get a center that's a little bit better than him in the offseason, I would say they should try to, or maybe another guard, but I lean more towards the center, but probably aren't going to make any major moves or not too many moves in 2020 offseason. Next up, we have the Minnesota Timberwolves, who are very good at the point guard and center positions. Towns, having a couple All-Star appearances in his career already in a few years that he's been in the league, shown that he can be a franchise player and be, he's one of the better centers in the league, one of the top centers in the league, who's a really good defensive threat, a good defender who can block the ball, rebound. He can also score and shoot threes on the offensive end, and they were able to get D'Angelo Russell from the Warriors at the trade deadline in this past season. So I think that those two players will play well together. Many people think that the Timberwolves should try and get Devin Booker and team those three up, and they could really make a deep playoff run. But I don't see that really happening this offseason. It would be hard to make a trade with the Suns for Booker, and I don't think the Suns would really want to trade him. So it would be more when he's a free agent. But in terms of this offseason, they were able to get Jarrett Culver in the past draft. So I think that he has some time to grow, needs to really work on his free throws, and isn't an amazing player, but definitely can be a role player and play well alongside the Timberwolves in a few years. So I think that the Timberwolves should really try and get a role player at the forward position, maybe the power forward, and that would help them out, or maybe the shooting guard, but I lean more towards power forward in free agency in this offseason. Next up, with the New Orleans Pelicans, who are one of the most hyped teams coming into this season. They did select Zion Williamson with the first overall pick. They also traded Anthony Davis in the offseason in return for Brandon Ingram, Lonzo Ball, and some other players. Ingram was an all-star this year, and Lonzo Ball had a productive year. Mostly a playmaker, racks up a lot of assists in games. Williamson was hurt most of the year, only played around 15 games, give or take some after that. So they had not a great year. Currently, they wouldn't make the playoffs if the season ended today, but with the NBA restart in Orlando, resuming with 8 games, they still have a chance, but it is not 100% that they're going to make the playoffs. They need the Grizzlies to play not so well, and they need to play really good and probably win at least like 6-7 games, or they'd aim for 8 to try and make the playoffs. So I don't think they're really going to make too much of a deep run. If they did make the playoffs this year, maybe at most go past the first round, but they would probably have to face the Clippers or the Lakers, so I don't think that would really happen. But one move I think they can make this season is getting a new center. maybe a veteran in free agency. They're pretty good at the guard position with Ball, Ingram, small forward, and Williamson as power forward. They are a bit of a young team. 3 players in Ingram, Ball, and Williamson are only in their first 3, 4, 5 years, or even less in Zion's case. It's his rookie year in the league. So they are a bit of a young team. So I think that they would need a good center next year and maybe some 3-point shooters to help them play better. Next, we have the New York Knicks, who need to make a lot of changes this offseason. They are really in a rebuild mode right now. They were able to make a good selection in the draft. With the 3rd pick, they got R.J. Barrett from Duke, who played alongside Zion Williamson at Duke in his freshman year. They also have Mitchell Robinson, who is a great defender at the center position, can rebound the ball and block the ball. So I think some pieces they need to make, if I can only pick one, I think they really need to trade for a great guard, someone that can really shoot the ball. They don't have any really key players. They had Julius Randle, but I think they need more than that to even become a 6th, 7th, or 8th seed in the Eastern Conference. I think their goal right now should just be trying to get to a playoff team, which they haven't been in a while since they had like Carmelo Anthony. So I really think they need to try and get an all-star caliber player, maybe make a trade this offseason, or try and sign a good free agent. Next up, we have the Oklahoma City Thunder, who had a pretty good year. They were able to get Shai Gilgeous-Alexander in the offseason. They had to break away their team with Russell Westbrook and Paul George. So they were able to trade Westbrook and get Chris Paul in return with a bunch of first-round picks. So I really think they have a good, bright future. And Shai Gilgeous-Alexander has shown that he can be an all-star player in a few years. So also with Steven Adams, who's a really decent center. I think one position they can improve at is maybe the power forward position. They have 2 good guards in Shea and Chris Paul. They have Gallinari as their power forward right now. So I think either forward position, if they can make a move this offseason, I think that would be ideal for them. Next up, we have the Orlando Magic, who have a ton of key small pieces to their team. Right now, they would make the playoffs. They have players like Jonathan Isaac, Nikola Vucevic, Evan Fournier, Markelle Fultz, and some other players. But not really any huge players. Vucevic was an all-star in the 2018-19 season, but no really huge all-star players on their team right now. Jonathan Isaac, this is his 3rd year. He had a big injury this year. More of a defender who I think has potential to be a great defender, but right now they're not really a great team, but they're not a horrible team. A lot of the teams below them in the Eastern Conference are also in rebuild mode, like the Knicks and the Pistons and the Hawks. But one move I think they should really make in the offseason is probably get an all-star player, maybe at the point guard position. Vucevic is a decent center who can play along another all-star. So maybe if they were able to get a point guard or a small forward, just any all-star caliber player who can make a difference on the team and give them a chance at making a deep run in the playoffs. Next up, we have the Philadelphia 76ers, who are currently in the mid to high seeds of the Eastern Conference of the top 8 teams. They haven't had a ton of great chemistry between Embiid and Simmons. Embiid, one of the better centers in the league, great on the offensive and defensive end. Really good in the inside, in the paint on offense, can also shoot the three. Also have Tobias Harris, who is close to an all-star caliber player, who plays well alongside Embiid and Simmons. So one move I think they can make in the offseason is probably to get an outside shooter, a mid-range shooter at the guard position. They do play Ben Simmons at point guard. He's more of an inside guy. Can't really shoot the three at all or mid-range. So they do have Josh Richardson, but if they can get another guard that is a threat from outside, that might increase their chances of playing better together and just having better chemistry. They do have Korkmaz, who is a great outside shooter too, but they probably need a guard that is able to start and make a difference on the offensive end. Next up, we have the Phoenix Suns, who have Devin Booker, who was an all-star for the first time this year. He's put up all-star numbers in the past few years, but wasn't able to be awarded an all-star. They were also able to get DeAndre Ayton in the 2018 draft. So they have a good center in DeAndre Ayton, who has a potential to be great on the defensive end and also a threat in the paint. Devin Booker can play shooting guard or either point guard or shooting guard, mostly a shooting guard. But he really shows that he can also be a franchise player and be a player that a team can get other players to play alongside him and try and make a run for a championship. So they were able to get Kelly Oubre, who had a decent year, not an amazing year, but still played pretty good. So I think if they can get maybe a power forward, they also had Ricky Rubio, who is a good playmaker at point guard. So I'm leaning more towards a power forward, small forward for them to try and get in the offseason and give the Suns a chance to be a playoff contending team next year. Next up, we have the Portland Trailblazers, who are like many other teams and are very strong at the guard position. Damien Lillard, in my opinion, is one of the best point guards in the league. I find him a bit underrating because I feel like he doesn't get enough credit for what he does. He is really a franchise player who has led Portland through the playoffs, especially last year when they made a deep playoff run, almost to the NBA Finals, but were short, losing to the Warriors in the Western Conference Finals. And CJ McCollum plays well alongside Lillard. Not an all-star player, but he is close to an all-star caliber player. He's a good player alongside him. They also were able to get Hassan Whiteside, who is one of the best defensive players in the league. Not one of the best, but he's a good defender, at the top in the league for blocks per game, and also a good rebounder. So one move I think they can make this offseason is maybe get a small forward or any forward. They were able to get Carmelo Anthony, who played decent. He made a good contribution to the team. So I'd probably lean towards them trying to get a small forward this offseason. Next up, we have the Sacramento Kings, who are also good at the guard position with De'Aaron Fox in his third year in the league. He can really drive the ball, and he's a good dunker, good finisher. He's also a good playmaker and can shoot mid-range shots. They were also able to get Marvin Bagley with the second pick in the 2018 draft, who hasn't been 100% healthy. I think if he stays healthy, he can be a good contribution to the Kings team. And they also have Buddy Hield, who plays shooting guard and sometimes small forward. So I think that the Kings would probably need to get a small forward or power forward just as a role player in the offseason. Maybe a little more than a role player, and a good player that can contribute to their starting five and put the Kings in playoff contention. Next up, we have the San Antonio Spurs, who have a lot of small pieces to their team. LaMarcus Aldridge, a veteran on the Spurs, as well as DeMar DeRozan, his second year with the Spurs. They also have DeJounte Murray, who's a young point guard who shows that he can be an all-star caliber player, or at least close to that. They also have Derek White, who's a decent player, and Jakob Poeltl, and some other small players, Patty Mills, but not really any huge players. LaMarcus Aldridge and DeRozan really the only all-star players on the team. Aldridge not really an all-star caliber player anymore towards the end of his career. Probably has a few years left, maybe 5, something around that. DeRozan, not in his prime, but still playing well. So one move I think that the Spurs can make this offseason is maybe trade for a draft pick. They do have some young players. They have Lonnie Walker, who I think has potential to be a good player. He hasn't played a ton of minutes, but from what I've seen, I think that he can be an all-star caliber player and be possibly a franchise player for the Spurs in the future. So I think maybe they should try and maybe trade LaMarcus Aldridge since it's towards the end of his career, and try and maybe package in some picks to try and get an all-star or some future picks. Next up, we have the Toronto Raptors, who had 2 all-stars this year, and Kyle Lowry and Siakam, also defending champs, winning the title last year. Still had a really good season, even though they lost Kawhi Leonard in free agency. They were the 2 seed in the Eastern Conference, so I think that they still are in contention for a title. Maybe not this year, with teams like the Lakers, Clippers, and the Bucks. But I think they still can be a championship contending team next year or in the next few years. They also have OG Anunoby, who has some potential, and some other small players. Also have Serge Ibaka and Fred VanVleet. So all these small pieces come together to make this a pretty good team. So I don't think they really need to make too many changes this offseason. Maybe get a backup center or a small forward, like a small forward role player, to play alongside Siakam, who is a young player and reaching his prime. So I really think that they don't need to make too many moves, but if they have to make some kind of move this offseason, I would say a small forward that's a role player. Next, we have the Utah Jazz, who have 2 all-stars with Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert this year. Rudy Gobert, one of the better defensive players in the league, has a few Defensive Player of the Year awards to him and defensive team awards. Donovan Mitchell, 3rd year in the league, was also an all-star this year. Pretty good on the offensive side, a force in the paint, and is a good mid-range shooter too. They do have some small players like Mike Conley, who's more of a role player at this point of his career at point guard, and Joe Ingles and Bojan Bogdanovic at the forward position. So I'd probably say that they can maybe try and go for a point guard, just a role player, this offseason. Maybe go for a sign or try and trade some of their picks. They are one of the higher seeds in the Western Conference, so I don't think they need to make too many moves, but yeah, I'd probably say they go for a role player at the point guard position if they had to make a move this offseason. Last, we have the Washington Wizards, whose main all-star is Bradley Beal. Has been named an all-star a couple of times, but was not this year. Surprisingly, even though he played really well, had a couple game winners, had one of the highest point per game averages in the league. I'm really surprised he wasn't an all-star. I guess the fan voting just didn't go his way. So I really think they should start building a team around him, because I think he's probably going to stay there the rest of his career. He's he has said that he is loyal to the Wizards and that he wants to stay there. Wizards able to get Rui Hachimura in the 2019 draft, who was a lottery pick and has shown that he has potential to play alongside Beal and be an all-star caliber player. They also have John Wall at point guard, who has been injured for quite a bit. Don't know if he's going to come back next season. Before he was injured, he was playing pretty good. He's been an all-star a couple of times. So I think a move that they can make this offseason is maybe getting a center, a decent center or forward. They're good at the guard position with Bradley Beal. Hachimura is a forward. So I think that if they could get a good defender at the center position, they have Thomas Bryant, but more not an all-star caliber player, but just a good defender for them that they can either get. Maybe like Tristan Thompson seems like he could be a good fit, or maybe they could try and trade an upcoming draft pick, depending on if they fall short in this or in the 8 games they play in Orlando. And then they would end up probably getting a lottery pick that can have some value in a trade. So I'd probably say for them to go out and get a good defender at the center position. That will do it for today's video. I appreciate it if you made it all the way up to this point. Probably one of my most lengthy videos I've ever made. So if you enjoyed this, please leave a like, subscribe for more content like this, and turn on notifications, and I'll see you later.